even if the fighting in Ukraine were to stop today, the last casualty from this war will likely be in 10, 20, or even 50 or more years from now. It's just the country is completely covered in landmines, and they're going to be causing death and destruction to innocent civilians for generations to come. There's a recent article in the Kyiv Independent titled, "Russia is covering Ukraine with landmines. Clearing them will be extremely difficult." I think a lot of the focus as of late has been on the military aspect of this. We look at Ukraine's offensive operations in the south and the eastern portions of the country, and one of their major challenges is how are they going to get through, how are they going to move military equipment through these incredibly dense minefields that Russia has laid to continue their attack and try to liberate more of their territory. And I think it's easy to forget that if Ukraine finds a gap in that minefield or breaches a gap in the minefield and penetrates the Russian line, the entire rest of the front is still littered with mines. Those aren't going away. Like if the front shifts 10 miles in one direction or the other, those mines still remain. Most of them uncovered. Most of them won't be identified. Most of them will remain, long after the war. They say in December 2022, Human Rights Watch confirmed that Russia was using 13 models of anti-personnel and 13 models of anti-vehicle landmines in its invasion of Ukraine, and that approximately 30% of the country, an area twice the size of Austria, had been contaminated with mines. Now, 30% of Ukrainian territory ends up being about 70,000 square miles, which is about the size of the state of Florida. The entire state is bigger than that, actually. Now, they're scattered all across the country, but just think about that. It's a massive area contaminated with mines. They say it's hard to count landmines through a storm of bullets and shell fragments, but what is known is that Russia, at the beginning of the full-scale invasion, had a stockpile of 26 million mines, the largest in the world according to various estimates. We have no idea how many mines are scattered all across Ukraine, just that certain areas are mined. Is the density every 3 meters? Is it every 300 meters? Is it anti-tank mines? Are they buried? Are they on the surface? It's unknown. Right. And there's not an easy answer to that question either. I've had a lot of people bring up things like, couldn't we have some sort of Bluetooth chip or a Wi-Fi chip or something in these mines to where after the war they can be easily identified and marked? But countries aren't going to do that because that could potentially give away the location of the mines to enemy forces. Right. There's a reason that these mines are being used, and it's because they're effective. They're causing a crazy amount of casualties and stopping Ukrainian progress and Russian progress in certain areas that neither side is going to do something that makes them easier to find for their enemy. So at the end of the day, we have no idea, just that they're out there. Now that gets into the question of, aren't landmines illegal? And they talk to that. They say to date, 164 countries are signatories to the 1997 Ottawa Treaty, more popularly known as the Mine Ban Treaty, which bans the use, production, and stockpiling of anti-personnel mines primarily due to their lasting threat to defenseless civilians and especially children. We've known about this risk for a long time, right? The U.S. dropped a ton of cluster munitions that had mines. Some were mines, some were unexploded cluster munitions across Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. And there are still people today being killed due to that. In Afghanistan, there are still people uncovering Soviet submunitions and Soviet mines from when they were there, 30, 40 years ago. Now, when I was in Afghanistan, we had at times would uncover what we thought were IEDs, and they were actually Soviet-era munitions that hadn't dead. It's crazy, right? They stay around for so long, and it's one of the reasons that this treaty was put into effect. They say while the vast majority of countries have spent years disassembling and destroying their stockpiles of landmines, Russia's military-industrial complex has been pouring money into R&D programs to create ever deadlier mines. I think a lot of times people think of mines as just very, very rudimentary types of weapons where they just sit out there and you scrape up against it, or the wind blows a little too hard and it goes off. But there's all sorts of different types. There's ones that shoot out tripwires when they hit the ground. There's others that pick up thermal signals. There's others that pick up vibrations on the ground. Others that fire submunitions into the air to target the top of tanks. Like they're pretty advanced, all things considered. And more countries that are continuing the development of some of these mines are not just finding ways for the mines to be more lethal and more deadly, but harder to detect. Right? It's a major component of the landmines being laid all across the country. Now, they mentioned that Russia is not a signatory to the Ottawa Treaty, neither is the United States, for what it's worth. But they say Ukraine did sign on in February of 1999. However, Ukraine has also been using landmines in this war, which I think it's kind of a bigger picture conversation about some of these laws of war, where If Ukraine were to not use mines in this war, it would put them at a disadvantage. So how do you level that if you're Ukraine, right? Are you going to not use something to help protect your country from an invading force? It's a pretty difficult conversation to have. Now, mines at the front are one thing. That's a military solution. It's Ukraine or Russia, whoever's trying to advance, trying to clear these minefields or identify these minefields under the threat of enemy fire, right? That is a certain problem set that happens during war. The other problem set is what they point to. Some of these groups are trying to resolve: the mines that are in areas now occupied by civilians. So at some point, the entire battlefield will again be occupied by civilians, or they'll try to occupy it. But for now, if you look at how much the lines have shifted in Ukraine from the early days of the war, the Russian advances and the retreats and all these different areas, there's a lot of areas where there's a ton of mines, and civilians are also trying to live in those areas. They call out a couple of these groups that are doing essentially civilian landmine removal, educating the public on what to look for and actually getting rid of mines in some of these areas where the military has moved through. They talk about the Mine Advisory Group as well as the Halo Trust, and I would like to add to that list Tip of the Spear Landmine Removal, run by Ryan Hendrickson. It is just awesome organization, incredible person. Ryan is a former U.S. Army Special Forces soldier. He was wounded in Afghanistan, and he's been putting his skill set to work in Ukraine, identifying these landmines, neutralizing them, and making some of these areas occupied by civilians safe for them to go about their daily lives. The organization, it's a registered 501c3, like it's a legit nonprofit. Ryan went to all that work to make sure that was done, and I think they're back in Ukraine right now. He continually is putting himself at risk to try to protect civilians behind the battlefield that he's never met and likely will never meet. If you want to support Ryan and his team, there's a couple different ways you can do that. You can follow them across social media. You can head over to their website, pick up one of these cool hats, a shirt, or just donate directly to their cause. Or you can just keep doing what you're doing right now. We're going to donate the first 30 days of ad revenue from this video to Tip the Spear. So thank you. Your being here, your watching this allows us to give to that incredible organization. Now, continuing on with the article, they say they've tried all sorts of different things to be able to mitigate the threat of these mines. And it's worth noting that the majority of this new technology is likely going towards the front. It's not being used in civilian areas. Maybe that'll come later, but it's one of the benefits of Tip of the Spear, Halo Trust, other organizations like that. They're actually able to put time and resources into demining the civilian areas right now because the civilians are there today and they're a threat immediately. But some of the things they're using towards the front are thermal imaging from drones. I don't know if you've seen, there's been various videos coming out showing how Ukraine has been able to identify minefields. In some situations, especially when it was warmer out in Ukraine, these mines, whether they're made out of metal or plastic or just have components from each, that absorbs heat more and retains that heat more than just the dry earth. So at night, when the temperature started to fall, the mines would still be hot for a period of time. And it allowed some of these drones to get an idea of where minefields might be located. Now, that only works if the mines are close-ish to the surface or even laid right on top, and just gives an idea of where a minefield might be. You wouldn't be able to take that and say with 100% certainty, you know where every mine is as you enter that area. In wrapping up, they say, hidden in its fields, underneath the snow, in the ruins of the cities the West has pledged to rebuild, the mines will lie in wait for Ukrainians returning home and for the generations who follow them. Just terrifying if you really think about that. It's what I mentioned right out the gate. If the war stops today, the shooting stops today, not another artillery round is fired, you've got decades worth of demining. And in that process, a lot of innocent people are going to die. A lot of children are going to die. This isn't something that's getting better. It's getting worse. And I understand why the focus is on the front, where the fighting is actually occurring and not in the rear in some of these civilian occupied areas. But, this is going to be a story, something we hear about for, again, generations to come. But that's all I got for now. Again, I will link this article as well as all of the Tip of the Spear landmine removal information in the description below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.